I balanced the casserole carefully in my hands, its warmth seeping through the old oven mitt I had pulled from my drawer that morning. The scent of baked chicken and rosemary clung to my coat, wrapping me in the same comfort I once gave my son whenever he came home hungry from school. I had timed it perfectly, just in time for Jonah and Elise to tumble through the door after daycare cheeks flushed ready for a homemade meal that didn't come from a box. Before I could reach for the doorbell, my phone vibrated. A short message lit up the screen. "Please don't come over. We just cleaned." I froze on the front step. The casserole sagged in my arms heavier than its actual weight. My eyes traced the words again, as if they might rearrange into something less cruel. But no. The message remained sterile and absolute. The porch light above me reflected against the glass panel beside the door. Out of habit, my eyes drifted toward the living room window. Inside, the space gleamed, as if lifted from a glossy magazine. White cushions, chrome accents, vases that didn't dare hold real flowers. And there, in the middle of it all, was Sable. My daughter-in-law, immaculate in her fitted blazer, laughing with two well-dressed couples who looked like they belonged on the cover of a real estate brochure. I pressed closer to the glass, my breath fogging the corner. Sable gestured toward the open-plan kitchen, showcasing its marble counters. Evan stood a few steps behind her, nodding politely, clutching a notepad as though he were her assistant instead of her husband. Jonah and Elise weren't in sight. It wasn't about cleaning. It wasn't about a stray crumb or the faint smell of roasted garlic that Sable always claimed lingered after my visits. No, this was a staging, a curated performance where I didn't fit the scene. My casserole, with its bubbling cheese and browned edges, didn't match the spotless fantasy she wanted to sell, and me, with my laugh lines and worn shoes, didn't belong in her showroom version of family life. My fingers tightened around the dish. I thought of Jonah's delight last week when he asked for Grandma's chicken with the crunchy top. He had licked his fingers clean, smiling so wide his missing tooth showed. Did he even know I was at the door now? Would he wonder why I hadn't come? The laughter inside rose a chorus I wasn't part of. I felt the oddest sensation, like I was standing outside a theater watching a play in which I had once held a starring role, but now wasn't even in the program. I stepped back from the window, the night air cool against my flushed cheeks. I wanted to knock to push open the door and announce myself the way I once did when Evan lived in a drafty apartment and begged me to bring over soup. But now the space between us was more than physical. It was curated, polished, and sealed tight, with a smile that wasn't mine. The casserole's steam seeped through the foil. I imagined setting it down on their perfect marble island, the aroma cutting through the sterile air, real and undeniable. But I remained on the porch, invisible, the outsider to my own family gathering. I turned the gravel crunching beneath my shoes as I walked back to my car. My reflection in the window pane followed me, a ghost of someone who had once been welcome. And with every step I carried not just the casserole, but the dawning realization that something inside me had shifted. Something that wouldn't shift back. The casserole sat untouched on the passenger seat as I drove home, its smell filling the car, both comforting and unbearable. My fingers curled around the steering wheel, stiff from the chill, and from something older, something that had lived in my joints for decades. These hands had carried more than food, they had carried whole years of survival. I remember the first winter after Evan's father left. The apartment heater rattled like an old man's cough, never strong enough to keep the cold out. Evan was only too little to understand why I layered him in sweaters at night, or why his crib was pulled close to my bed. He clutched my thumb in his tiny fist, and I swore I would never let him feel abandoned again, even if it meant losing myself. By day, I worked the admitting desk at St. Paul's Hospital, checking in patients with voices raw from pain. By night, I scrubbed floors in private clinics, the bleach stinging my skin until my knuckles cracked. I learned to tape bandages around my palms just so I could keep working without bleeding into the mop water. But no matter how exhausted I was, I still made mornings ours. I'd pack Evan's lunch with hand-cut sandwiches and leave a note folded inside, "Be brave today. Love, Mom." When he brought home spelling tests with gold stars, I pinned them above the sink, where I'd see them while scrubbing dishes, proof that the sacrifices weren't for nothing. The hardest choice came when Evan turned 8 and begged to learn piano. Lessons were $50 a week more than I spent on groceries some months. I studied the numbers until they blurred, then cut out everything that wasn't essential. I stitched my own skirts, gave up buying coffee at the corner cafe, and started taking extra night shifts. My body protested, but his joy silenced every ache. Thursday afternoons, I'd sit on a hard plastic chair in the conservatory hallway while Evan played scales behind a closed door. My eyelids drooped, but then came the melody of Fur-Elise, halting at first, then smoother as weeks passed. Each note was a promise that if I kept holding on, his world would be larger than mine. I kept all of his recital programs in a shoebox, along with the birthday cards he made out of folded notebook paper. To the best mom, one read, with a stick figure of me holding a frying pan. His handwriting was crooked, his drawing clumsy, but it was my gallery of riches. There were milestones no one else saw but me. The day he rode a bike without training wheels wobbling down the cracked sidewalk while I ran beside him with outstretched arms. The day he stood at his high school graduation cap, sliding off his head, searching the crowd until our eyes met. And later, the moment he called from his first job interview, his voice trembling with pride. I got it, Mom. I really did. Every wrinkle on my hands is stitched with those memories. These fingers cooked, mended, and applauded until they were raw. They pushed Evan forward at every stage, never once pulling back. And now those same hands had been stopped cold by a text telling me not to enter. When I parked outside my small house, the casserole had cooled, its aroma dulled, but it still felt heavy in my arms as I carried it inside. I placed it on the counter, the foil crinkling under my fingertips. My palms throbbed with the memory of bleach piano notes and all the years when love had been my only currency. I sat down at the kitchen table staring at my hands. They had built a life, but suddenly I wasn't sure if Evan or anyone could still read the language written in them. And as I sat there, silence pressing against the walls, I realized my story with Sable and Evan was only beginning to unfold. The following Sunday, I arrived at their house for dinner casserole left behind this time. I told myself it would be different, that maybe Sable had sent that message in a rush, that maybe Evan hadn't realized how it cut. I wore a navy blouse I hadn't taken out in years and brought a lemon tart from the bakery down the street, something simple, not homemade, so as not to mess up her kitchen. The moment I stepped inside, the scent of lemon polish and lavender hit me, not the aroma of food. Everything gleamed as if no one actually lived there. Jonah and Elise ran to hug me, and my heart lifted briefly, their small arms tightening around my waist. Their joy was real, unpolished, the only thing that felt untouched by Sable's perfection. We gathered in the dining room, a long table already set, like a magazine spread, gold-rimmed plates, linen napkins folded into swans. Sable hovered near the chairs, directing Evan to pour water, reminding the children not to touch anything until everyone sat. I noticed on the wall behind her a new arrangement of framed photos. At first, my eyes warmed at seeing Jonah in his soccer uniform, Elise in her tutu, Evan smiling in a crisp suit. But as I leaned closer, I caught my breath. One frame showed Jonah's birthday party from last year. I remembered that day clearly. I had stood beside Evan while Jonah blew out the candles, my hand on his shoulder. But in this photograph, the space where I had been was gone, cropped neatly, leaving only Evan, Sable, and the children smiling at the cake. My heart stumbled in my chest. I searched the other frames quickly. Graduation photo, Evan in cap and gown, his arm originally around my shoulder. Here, only his torso and smile, my body cut clean from the edge. Another Christmas morning, I had been seated on the rug, unwrapping toys with the children. In this version, the angle cut me out entirely, leaving a tidy picture of just Sable, Evan, and the children before the tree. I swallowed hard, my tart box trembling in my hands. Evan didn't seem to notice, too busy adjusting Elise's napkin. Sable followed my gaze for a brief second, her mouth curving into the faintest smile, a shrug casual as if to say, "This is better." I set the tart down on the sideboard, smoothing my blouse with shaking fingers. "Nice photos," I murmured, careful to keep my voice even. "Thank you," Sable said brightly. "We had them edited for the gallery wall. Cleaner that way, more focused." Focused. That was the word she used, as if I were clutter. Dinner passed with small talk. Jonah, chattering about dinosaurs. Elise spilling water. Evan dutifully refilling glasses. I forced smiles, forced laughter. I chewed each bite without tasting. My eyes kept drifting back to that wall, those frames where my presents had been clipped like unwanted weeds from a garden. After dessert, Jonah asked Grandma, "Do you have pictures of us at your house?" "Yes, sweetheart," I said softly. "I keep them all in albums." His face brightened. "Can I see them next time?" I nodded, though my throat ached too much to add more. Sable quickly ushered him toward the sink, talking about homework. When the evening ended, I kissed the children goodbye and stepped back into the night air. The sky was clear, sharp stars overhead, but I felt erased, smaller than the shadows on the driveway. I drove home in silence, the lemon tart box still half full beside me. On my kitchen table, I opened one of my albums, flipping to the very same birthday photo, the unedited version. There I was, smiling, wide my hand steady on Jonah's shoulder. Proof that I had stood there once, even if their walls said otherwise. I traced the image with my fingertip, knowing this was only the beginning of being cut out of a life I had built piece by piece. And somewhere deep inside, I began to understand that silence might no longer be enough. I couldn't sleep that night. The images of those cropped photographs clung to me like shadows on the wall. I lay staring at the ceiling, the silence of my house pressing in. Every frame on their wall told me the same thing, that my presence was inconvenient, something to be trimmed away. My mind wandered back to when things had been different before boundaries and standards became weapons. It started so simply. Sable had just given birth to Jonah, and one afternoon she called me sounding exhausted. "Could you watch him for just a week while I recover? Just until I'm back on my feet." Of course I said yes. What mother wouldn't? That week stretched into another, and then into months. By the time Elise was born, I was practically running a small daycare out of my living room. No pay, no schedule, no thanks, only expectation. I remember one morning vividly. Evan dropped Jonah off at 7 sharp, Elise, still in her pajamas, a diaper bag slung over his arm. "We'll pick them up late tonight," he said, already halfway out the door. I stood there with a spatula in one hand, the frying pan hissing behind me, trying to remind him I had plans that day. But the words stuck in my throat because Jonah was already clinging to my leg, and Elise's tiny hands reached for me as if I were the only steady thing in her world. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it was love. Back then, Sable even handed me a spare key, pressing it into my palm like it was a gift. "So, you can come in if we're running late," she said. I tucked it onto my key ring, proud of the trust it symbolized. I imagined myself woven into the daily rhythm of their lives, trusted, needed family. But years later, the request came like a slap. "We're having the locks changed," Sable said casually one Sunday after dinner. She passed me a slice of pie, like nothing had shifted. "Could you return the old key? It's just for safety, you know." I stared at her fork frozen halfway to my mouth. "Safety?" I repeated. "Yes," she said, lightly. "The neighborhood's changing, and we just want to be careful about who has access." Careful? As if I were a liability. As if my hands, which had rocked her babies and folded their laundry, were untrustworthy. Evan had glanced down at his plate, chewing slowly, not daring to intervene. My fingers fumbled in my purse until I found the key, the brass warm from years of use. I placed it on the table beside her plate. The small clink it made against the china felt like the severing of a bond I hadn't realized was fragile. On the drive home that night, the space on my key ring felt like a missing tooth. I turned the wheel with bare fingers, realizing how much of myself I had given without asking for anything in return. Hours, years, pieces of my identity all handed over freely as if my worth existed only in service. And now, stripped of a key, stripped of a place in their photographs, I understood that love without respect is just labor in disguise. I sat in my kitchen again, flipping open my old photo albums for comfort, when the phone buzzed across the table. A new message lit the screen. Another request, another favor. I stared at it, my hands trembling, feeling a tide rising in me I had never allowed before. The message on my phone was short. "Can you take the kids tomorrow?" No please, no explanation. No acknowledgement that it was Sunday night, and I might have plans of my own. I set the phone down and stared at the quiet kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence as I reached for a notepad from the drawer. For once, I wasn't going to answer right away. Instead, I began to calculate. I wrote down the rough years from Jonah's birth until now 8 years, Elise 5. Nearly every weekday, often. Weekends, holidays, emergencies. Some nights stretched into overnights. I did the math slowly, the numbers piling up like stones. 40 to 50 hours a week at minimum. More than 30,000 hours of childcare unpaid. I paused, pen shaking between my fingers. 30,000 hours. If I had been compensated even modestly at $15 an hour, it came to nearly $500,000. $500,000. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the total as though it belonged to someone else's life. My love had been dressed up as duty, and my duty disguised as charity. But underneath it all, what I had given was labor. Relentless, invisible labor. The next day, I arrived at their house with the casserole dish I had washed from the week before. Sable greeted me at the door phone, in hand-polished nails gleaming as she scrolled through messages. "Thanks for coming on such short notice," she said, brushing past me. "Evan's caught up at the firm, and I have a client lunch. Couldn't do it without you." I set the dish down on the counter and looked at her, really looked. Her blouse was silk, her heels sharp, her hair styled into the kind of effortless perfection you only get from paying someone else. Meanwhile, My own shoes were worn from years of rushing between school pickups and grocery runs, my hands etched with lines from scrubbing and folding. Something rose in me, steady and firm. "Sable," I said quietly. "I think it's time we talk about this arrangement." She blinked at me, confused. "Arrangement?" "Yes," I continued. "I've been caring for Jonah and Elise for years now. If you counted the hours, it would be more than 30,000. That's not just family help. That's a full-time career." Her smile froze, eyes darting to the doorway as though hoping Evan would appear and rescue her from the conversation. "Lorraine, you know we're family. We don't keep score like that." "Families respect each other," I replied, my voice calmer than I felt. "Respect means acknowledging what's given. And what I've been giving is work. I've been your nanny, your cook, your chauffeur, your stand-in at school events. And I've never asked for a cent. But if you're going to continue treating me as your full-time caregiver, then I should be paid like one." Her eyes widened, a flash of indignation breaking through her practiced composure. "Paid?" she repeated, as though the word were foreign. "Yes," I said, holding her gaze. "Paid. Just like you pay the housekeeper who comes once a week, just like you pay the gardener. I deserve no less dignity." For a moment, silence stretched between us. I could hear the faint cartoon voices from the living room where the children sat, unaware that the ground beneath their family was shifting. Sable opened her mouth, closed it again, then forced a thin smile. "I'll talk to Evan about it." Her tone was tight, brittle, like glass about to crack. I nodded, knowing the conversation was only beginning. Inside, though, something unfurled a quiet certainty that I had finally placed value on myself. That night, back in my own home, I folded the notepad with the hours and wages neatly into an envelope. I slid it into my desk drawer next to the worn spare keys I no longer needed. For the first time in years, I felt like I was holding a ledger where the balance could change. And it was with that envelope tucked away that I began to think not just about what I deserved, but what I might finally demand. The phone rang the following evening. I knew it would. Sable's number glowed across the screen, her name sharp as if etched in glass. I answered, bracing myself. "We need to talk," she said, skipping pleasantries. Her tone was brittle, high-strung. "Come by tomorrow at 7. Evan will be home." I arrived to find them waiting at the kitchen island, side by side but not united. Sable's arms were folded tight across her chest, her nails clicking against her sleeve. Evan's face was calm, almost too calm, as though he had rehearsed neutrality in the mirror. Sable launched first. "I cannot believe you would demand money from us, from your own son." I set my bag down and met her gaze. "I didn't demand. I said, if you want me to keep providing full-time childcare, it should be compensated. Like anyone else's labor." She gave a sharp laugh, more bark than humor. "You're their grandmother, Lorraine. Grandmothers don't send invoices. They help, they give. That's what family does." "Family also respects one another," I answered softly. "Respect?" Her voice rose, splintering against the walls. "Do you have any idea how selfish this sounds after everything we've given you? Holidays, dinners, a place in our children's lives, you turn around and put a price tag on it." Her words cut, but the wound didn't bleed the way it used to. I thought of the notepad in my drawer, of the 30,000 hours tallied in ink, of how invisible all that time had been. Evan finally cleared his throat. "Mom, maybe we can find some middle ground." I turned to him, searching for the boy who once begged me to stay at his bedside during thunderstorms, who clutched my hand walking into his first piano recital. But the man before me wouldn't meet my eyes. his stare fixed on the countertop, polished and spotless, reflecting the overhead lights, but none of the history between us. His silence said more than any words could. It told me I was alone in this. I'm not asking for luxuries. I continued, my voice steady, though my heart pounded. I'm asking to be treated fairly. If I were a stranger walking through this door, you'd pay me without hesitation. Sable slammed her palm down on the counter. You're not a stranger. You're supposed to love these children unconditionally. You're supposed to be there when we need you. That's what grandmothers do. Her words hung in the air, echoing. Supposed to. Supposed to. Something inside me shifted. For decades, I had been everything I was supposed to be, dutiful wife until my husband left, tireless mother, raising Evan alone, invisible grandmother, filling in every gap. And still, it was never enough. No, I said. One word. Simple, final. Sable blinked as if she hadn't heard correctly. Evan's head jerked up. No, Sable repeated, incredulous. No, I said again, stronger this time. I won't keep doing this for free, and I won't keep letting myself be treated like a convenience. If that makes me selfish, so be it. Silence fell thick and suffocating. Evan rubbed his temples, caught between his wife's glare and my resolve. But he said nothing. I picked up my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and walked to the door. My steps felt heavier than stone, but steadier than they had in years. As I pulled the door shut behind me, I heard Sable's voice rising again, sharp and furious, but the words blurred into nothing. What I carried with me was the echo of my own voice, firm, unshaken. And for the first time in my life, a no felt like freedom. The night air met me with a chill as I walked down their driveway, the street quiet, the stars faint above the glow of porch lights. My heart ached, but beneath the ache was something new, something that felt like the beginning of a different kind of truth. I thought the silence would last longer. After my no, I imagined days, maybe weeks of space before the next wound came. But the blow arrived faster than I expected, delivered not in whispers or arguments, but through the blinding brightness of a phone screen. It was Marjorie, an old colleague from the hospital, who called first. Lorraine, have you seen Sable's post? Her voice was hesitant, the way someone sounds when they're about to tell you a truth you can't unhear. I hadn't, of course. I used my phone mostly for calls and the occasional text. But Marjorie read it aloud. Blessed to have found a professional nanny so reliable, so perfect for our lifestyle. Couldn't ask for more? Her words tumbled into me like glass shards. Reliable. Perfect. Professional. As though I had never existed. As though the years of my sweat and hands and sleepless nights were less than nothing. By the time Marjorie hung up, my hands were trembling. I opened the app reluctantly, something I rarely did, and there it was. Sable's carefully staged photograph of Jonah and Elise hugging a woman I had never met. Their smiles were bright, their clothes spotless, the caption smothered in emojis of hearts and halos. Underneath, a flood of comments. You're such an inspiration, Sable. Love seeing moms with it all together. This is goals. Thousands of likes, a parade of praise. Not a single mention of me. Not a single trace of what I had given. In public, I had been erased. I sat there staring at the glow until my eyes stung. My life's work had been reduced to a digital illusion, a performance curated for strangers to applaud. And then, as if the knife hadn't sunk deep enough, the twist came. That evening, my phone buzzed again. A message from Beatrix, another old friend who had always been better with technology than I was. Lorraine, you need to see this. Screenshots attached. I opened them slowly, heart hammering. It was a group chat Sable with two of her friends. The words were blunt, written in the casual cruelty of people who believe no one else will ever read them. We've finally moved on from Lorraine. Thank God. I couldn't stand the old-fashioned vibe anymore. Plus, Evan and I have been talking better to cut her out of the inheritance conversation now, before things get messy. Cut me out. The inheritance conversation. I pressed a hand to my chest as though that might stop the pounding inside. After all the unpaid hours, after the years of giving and giving until I was hollow, they were not only erasing me from their daily lives, but preparing to erase me from the future as well. I closed my eyes and remembered the promises Evan made when he was younger. When I grow up, Mom, I'll take care of you. You'll never have to worry. How quickly those words had dissolved into silence, into complicity. The screenshots burned in my hand. I didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, a strange clarity settled over me, as if the betrayal had finally cleared the fog I'd been walking through. They weren't just trimming me from photographs or changing locks. They were dismantling every trace of my place in their story, family, legacy, dignity. If they were writing me out, then I would have to write my own chapter. Not in their home, not in their accounts, not on their glossy feeds. Somewhere that was mine. I folded the printed screenshots Beatrix had dropped off later that week and slipped them into the same envelope where I kept my tally of unpaid hours. Proof, evidence, and perhaps fuel. As I locked the drawer that night, I realized something unexpected erasure might hurt, but it could also clear the page. And maybe, just maybe, I was ready to start drafting a new story with my name written at the top. The screenshots lived in my desk drawer, but their weight pressed on me even when the drawer was closed. At night, I found myself lying awake, replaying Sable's words cut her out of the inheritance conversation. They weren't only erasing my past, they were plotting to erase my future. Something hardened inside me. If my worth to them could be measured only in utility or in assets, then it was time to step outside their ledger. For once in my life, I would invest in myself. The next morning, I called Finch Marrow. Finch had been my colleague decades ago when I worked as an administrator at St. Alden's Hospital. He'd gone on to build a respectable law practice, but he never lost the warmth that made him an anchor in my early years. "Lorraine," he said, when he picked up his voice, gravelly but steady. "I was wondering when you'd call. What's on your mind? I want to buy something," I said. "A house. Not just a place to live, but a place that's mine. Secure. Untouchable." He was quiet for a moment, then replied, "All right. But if you're serious, we need to talk about what's safe. No rash decisions." We met that afternoon at a coffee shop near the courthouse. Finch brought a folder thick with papers, charts, market analyses, recommendations. He was always thorough. Over steaming mugs, he walked me through the basics. You need to think beyond sentiment. Liquidity taxes, upkeep. Don't buy a burden. I nodded, taking notes, though my heart was already miles ahead of his practicalities. I wasn't looking for a portfolio piece. I was looking for a foundation. After our meeting, I toured a handful of properties. Shiny condos with rooftop gyms, suburban houses with manicured lawns, sterile new builds with identical facades. None of them spoke to me. Each felt like someone else's dream, not mine. Then one rainy Thursday, I stumbled across a listing for a probate sale. A historic home on the edge of town appraised at $2.5 million, its price cut from years of neglect and the urgency of settlement. I drove out to see it, windshield wipers fighting the storm. The house rose at the end of a tree-lined street, its brickwork weathered, but proud, wide windows staring like wise old eyes. The sign out front was crooked rain streaking its faded paint. Inside, dust coated the hardwood floors, and the wallpaper peeled like tired skin. Yet I could feel something alive in those walls. In the foyer hung a tarnished brass plaque, Dr. Elias Harland, 1912. My chest tightened. Dr. Harland had been one of the founders of the medical board at St. Alden's, his name etched into the hospital's earliest records. I remembered poring over his notes during my years as an administrator, marveling at his meticulous attention to patient dignity. Standing there, I could almost hear the echo of orderly footsteps, the hush of serious voices, the scent of antiseptic and hope. This house had carried medicine in its bones, and medicine had carried me all my life. I walked through each room, slowly running my hand over the banisters, listening to the creak of the stairs. The house was battered but unbowed, just like me. I saw not decay, but possibility laughter in the parlor sunlight, spilling across polished floors, shelves lined with books and photographs. My photographs not cropped or erased. By the time I returned to the foyer, my decision was made. This wasn't just property, it was proof, a door that no one could take from me. The realtor, surprised at my certainty, asked if I wanted time to think. I shook my head. No. Draft the papers. I'm buying it. As I stepped back into the rain, the house loomed behind me, not a ruin, but a beginning. And in the rhythm of the falling drops, I felt the first faint beat of dignity, rebuilding itself brick by brick. The papers were signed on a Monday afternoon, the kind of crisp day when the sky feels scrubbed clean. The notary's pen scratched across the final line, and just like that, the house was mine. Not Evan's, not Sable's, not anyone's to debate over mine. When the agent slid the keys across the desk, I felt a tremor run through my fingers. They weren't polished or new, just two solid brass keys on a plain ring, the metal dulled from age. But the weight of them in my palm was heavier than any set of keys I had ever held. They carried history, and now they carried me. I didn't drive straight to the house. Instead, I went home. First, set my bag on the table and pulled open the desk drawer where I kept my envelope of unpaid hours and screenshots. I placed one of the brass keys inside, folded the paper around it, and whispered aloud, as though making a vow. Not for intrusion, only for respect. It was the first time in years I had given myself a rule that wasn't about sacrifice, but about dignity. That evening, I walked through the house, slowly turning lights on room by room. Dust motes floated in the air, but they didn't bother me. Each creak of the floorboards felt like a greeting. I stood in the parlor, tracing the outline where portraits must have once hung, and imagined what I would put there. My parents' wedding photo. Evan as a boy at his piano recital. Even snapshots of myself in the hospital cafeteria. Hair tucked back. Smile tired but proud. Proof of a life lived. In the kitchen, I ran my hand across the counters worn smooth from decades of meals prepared. I thought of all the casseroles I had carried to Evan's house, the dishes that had been turned away, and knew this kitchen would hold meals only for those who valued the hands that made them. The upstairs bedroom, though empty, seemed to exhale peace. I pictured curtains lifting in the summer breeze, books stacked on a nightstand, a lamp glowing gently in the dark. A room that wouldn't ask anything of me but rest. For the first time, I felt no need to apologize for wanting space of my own. I didn't imagine Jonah and Elise spilling toys across the floor, or Sable's sharp voice carrying from the next room. The silence belonged to me, and it felt holy. Back at my apartment, I placed the second brass key on a small velvet pad inside my desk drawer next to the one already tucked in the envelope. I closed the drawer slowly, letting the lock click into place. My hands lingered there, steady. I had spent a lifetime opening doors for others, into classrooms, into opportunities, into homes that were not mine. But now, at 68, I held the right to close one behind me. To guard it, not out of fear, but out of respect for myself and for whoever proved worthy of crossing its threshold. That night, as I slid into bed, the image of the house glowed in my mind, brick walls strong against the night. It no longer felt like a purchase. It felt like a second chance. And with the brass key safe in my drawer, I knew exactly where the next chapter of my life would begin. The first week in the house felt like stepping into a memory that wasn't mine. Every corner seemed to whisper, as though the walls were still carrying conversations from decades before. The floors creaked, not just under my steps, but as if in greeting a reminder that many feet had passed this way long before me. One rainy morning, I decided to explore the attic. The stairs groaned beneath my weight, and the air grew musty as I pushed open the narrow door. Dust lay heavy over everything, trunks, boxes, and stacks of forgotten furniture draped in yellowing sheets. I pulled the chain of a bare bulb and saw an old cedar trunk tucked in the far corner. Its lock had rusted clean through, and it opened with little resistance. Inside, layered among moth-eaten blankets, were several leather-bound journals. The covers were cracked, but when I lifted one, the inked handwriting was surprisingly clear. The first entry I read was dated 1927. Dr. Harland insists the nurses enter through the side door so the patients won't see women rushing about. Dignity, he calls it. I call it humiliation. I froze, the words cutting into me across nearly a century. I read on page after page the nurse, her name was Margaret, documenting small rebellions, refusing to stand silently in the back of meetings, insisting on proper rest breaks for her trainees, speaking out when her male superiors dismissed her. Her handwriting grew sharper, more urgent as the years passed. They say we're servants. I say we're lifelines. Someday the walls will remember our names, not just the doctor's plaques. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor holding that journal as though it were a letter written directly to me. Margaret had fought for respect inside hospital halls. I was fighting for it inside my family. Our battlefields were different, but the wounds were the same. Later that afternoon, as I walked the property line, I saw a woman about my age standing by the hedge that separated my yard from the next. She wore a windbreaker, her dark hair pulled back, and she had the posture of someone who had spent a career sizing up situations before speaking. "You must be the new owner," she called, her voice warm but measured. Mina Shu. Detective retired, though the neighbors still ask me to settle their squabbles. I introduced myself, and soon we were walking the perimeter together, her stride steady beside mine. She asked if I lived alone, and I surprised myself by answering without hesitation. Yes, and it feels right. Mina nodded knowingly. Independence always does. Hard-earned, though. As we walked, I told her about finding the journals. Mina's eyes lit with interest. History has a way of handing us courage we didn't know we had. You should keep reading. Sometimes strangers become the ancestors we need. Her words lingered after she left. That evening, I opened Margaret's journals again, reading by the soft glow of a lamp. Each line felt like a hand at my back, steadying me. If she could carve dignity from a world that tried to silence her, then perhaps I could do the same. By the time I closed the journal, my hands no longer shook. The echoes of old lives had found me, and in them, I discovered the first steady notes of my own voice. News of Sable's success had always circulated through family dinners, holiday gatherings, and social media. Every week seemed to bring another congratulatory post, another glossy photograph of her posing in front of a sold sign, with clients smiling beside her. But when the polish began to fade, I noticed it before Evan did. It started with whispers among neighbors, little comments overheard at the grocery store, or while waiting in line at the post office. She's too focused on appearances. Always late with paperwork. Sweet as honey until the contract's signed, then impossible to reach. At first, I dismissed it as the pettiness that comes with competition. But then Marjorie, my old colleague, told me her niece had tried to buy a house through Sable. She couldn't shake the feeling your daughter-in-law was selling a performance, not a property. She said gently, as though worried she was betraying me by sharing it. The image Sable curated online perfection, draped in designer clothes, smiling family portraits. Flawless homes was beginning to ring false in real life. Clients sensed it. Deals slipped. Her polish once her strength was turning brittle. Meanwhile, my own boundaries were tested again. One Thursday afternoon, just as I was lacing up my shoes for a walk with Mina, my phone buzzed. Evan's voice spilled through before I could even greet him. "Mom, can you pick up the kids from school today? Sable's caught in traffic and I have a meeting I can't leave." For a moment, my old reflex flared the instinct to drop everything and rush over. But I looked down at my walking shoes. The laces finally tied the journals still spread open on my desk. Upstairs, the house I had claimed as mine. "No," I said evenly. "Not today." There was silence on the line, heavy as stone. "Mom, it's just this once," Evan said, finally his voice fraying at the edges. "No," I repeated, gentler but firm. "You and Sable are their parents. You'll figure it out." I heard his sharp inhale, the beginning of frustration. "You don't understand." I'm in the middle of I do understand. I cut in, though my chest ached. And I also understand what 30,000 unpaid hours felt like. Today I have plans. You'll manage. He hung up without another word. For the first time in my life, the silence that followed didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like air in my lungs. Later that evening, Evan showed up at my door. His shoulders slumped, tie askew. The boy still visible beneath the man. We had to pay a sitter at the last minute, he admitted. The kids were confused. Jonah asked why you didn't come. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling against the teacup I was holding. "Because it's not my job to always come," I said softly. His eyes flickered, torn between understanding and hurt. "I just don't know how to handle it when you say no." "You'll learn," I told him, and for once, I felt the truth of it. He would have to. As he left, I noticed the weariness etched into his face. Sable's perfect world was cracking, his marriage straining beneath its surface. He didn't say it outright, but I could feel the pull in him, the boy who had once relied on me for everything, now realizing I wouldn't be the net to catch him anymore. I closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a long moment. The brass key in my desk seemed to hum like a heartbeat, in the silence, reminding me that dignity once claimed could not be returned. And as the night deepened, I knew the cracks in Sable's spotless facade were only the beginning. The next weekend, Jonah and Elise came to stay with me for the first time in the new house. Evan had called tentative, as though he wasn't sure I'd agree. I had surprised him by saying yes, but on my terms, the children would come to me, not the other way around, and there would be no last-minute changes. When their small bodies tumbled through the front door, the house exhaled. It had been waiting for their voices, for footsteps that weren't only mine. Jonah ran straight for the staircase, his sneakers squeaking on the wood, while Elise twirled in the entryway, her giggles echoing against the high ceiling. "Grandma? Can we bake cookies?" Elise asked, already tugging at my hand. Of course, I said, and led them into the kitchen. We pulled out flour sugar and chocolate chips. I tied dish towels around their waists for aprons, though they hardly stayed in place. Soon, flour dusted every surface, powdering Jonah's hair and coating Elise's cheeks like war paint. I didn't scold them. Instead, I laughed, letting the mess fall where it would. When the first tray came out of the oven, golden and uneven, Jonah grabbed one before it cooled, juggling it between his palms. Best ever, he declared with his mouth full. Elise nodded her eyes wide with approval. The crumbs scattered across the floor, but I only brushed them aside with my foot. This was what a kitchen was meant for. Later, we pulled out washable paints I'd bought just for them. Can we really? Jonah asked, his eyes widening when I handed him a brush and pointed to the blank wall in the sunroom. Yes, I said, but only this wall. They squealed with delight. Jonah painted bold blue streaks that reached as high as he could stretch, while Elise dabbed pink and yellow circles near the baseboards. By the end of the afternoon, the wall looked like a storm of color, wild and imperfect, but alive. Their little hands left smudges where they leaned too close, and Elise stamped her palm prints in a line that marched across the bottom like a secret signature. I stood back and watched them, my heart swelling in a way I hadn't felt in years. This house, which had carried so much silence and dust, was alive again. Not with curated photos or staged perfection, but with noise and stains and the evidence of joy. We ate dinner, picnic style, on the living room floor, paper plates balanced on our laps. Jonah spilled juice. Elise dropped a noodle, and I let it be. The rug could be cleaned. What mattered was the sound of their laughter, sharp and real, filling the house until it felt like the walls were vibrating with it. That night, when they were tucked into the guest room under quilts I had pulled from storage, Jonah whispered sleepily, "Grandma, I like your house better. It feels fun." Elise, already half asleep, murmured, "It smells like cookies." I kissed their foreheads, tucking the blankets close. "That's because this is a house for living," I said softly, though they were already gone to dreams. After they fell asleep, I wandered downstairs. The kitchen counters were sticky with sugar, the floor tracked with crumbs, and the sunroom wall was a riot of colors. I didn't feel the urge to scrub or polish. Instead, I sank into a chair and let the mess surround me like proof of something sacred. The house no longer belonged to dust and silence. It belonged to memory being made to joy that dared to leave a trace. And as I sat there listening to the muffled sound of my grandchildren breathing upstairs, I knew the life I was building in these walls was just beginning to grow louder. The Monday after Jonah and Elise stayed with me, I woke to 3 missed calls and a string of messages from Evan. Each one grew more frantic than the last. "Mom, can you please call me? Sable needs you to watch the kids today. It's urgent." "Where are you?" I had seen the messages the night before, but I hadn't answered. It wasn't my responsibility anymore to leap every time they called. I had told them no, and I meant it. By mid-morning, I learned what my silence had cost. Sable had arranged a showing with a wealthy couple, one of those dream clients she bragged about endlessly. But when her sitter canceled, she assumed I would step in. She left for the meeting anyway, children in tow, hoping to juggle both. The story reached me in fragments first, from Evan's hesitant voice on the phone, and later through whispers that spread faster than she could contain them. Jonah had knocked over a glass vase in the client's entryway. Elise had started crying when the couple asked pointed questions about the property. The showing dissolved into chaos. The clients walked away muttering about professionalism. By the time Sable got them back to her car, her deal had crumbled. That evening, Evan drove over alone. He stood in my kitchen looking hollow, like someone had scraped the light out of him. "She lost the listing," he said quietly. "She blames you." I leaned against the counter, steadying myself. "Because I wouldn't come running." His silence was answer enough. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were tired. "She said, you could have prevented it." "I've prevented 1,000 little disasters over the years." I replied, my voice calm. And every time I did it only made the next demand easier to place on me. But this time, I chose myself. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but the words caught in his throat. He shook his head instead, shoulders sagging. The fallout spread faster than either of us expected. By the next day, a local blog had picked up the story. They framed it as gossip at first luxury realtor's deal implodes amid childcare drama, but within hours comments piled up. Neighbors, acquaintances, even strangers weighed in. Why was she dragging kids to $1 million showing sounds like her mother-in-law set boundaries? Good for her. Grandparents aren't free labor. Respect goes both ways. I read through the comments with a mix of astonishment and quiet vindication. For years, my sacrifices had been invisible, swallowed in silence. Now, for the first time, other voices were echoing mine, calling out what I hadn't dared to say aloud. Sable's curated image began to crack. The polished realtor with the perfect home, the perfect family, the perfect career. Suddenly, she looked careless, unprepared, even exploitative. She scrambled to defend herself, posting photos of spotless rooms and glowing testimonials. But the undertone of criticism remained. For once, I didn't feel the urge to shield her. I didn't rush in to patch the holes or quiet the storm. Instead, I brewed tea and sat by the window, watching the light shift across the painted wall where Jonah and Elise had left their handprints. Those smudges meant more than all of Sable's glossy portraits combined. They were imperfect, real and alive, everything her showroom version of family could never be. Evan called again late that night. His voice was low, frayed at the edges. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. "You can't fix it for her," I told him gently. "She'll have to face the cracks herself." There was a long pause before he said, almost to himself, "Maybe we all will." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet house, the brass key heavy in my pocket. The community was beginning to see the truth, but truth has a way of demanding more once it surfaces. And I knew the storm was far from over. When the gossip had finally settled into silence, I called Finch. He answered on the second ring, his voice rough but alert, as though he'd been waiting for me to make the move. "I need to put things in writing," I said. "Good," he replied without hesitation. "Let's make it clear where the boundaries are. A contract is sometimes the only language people respect." 2 days later, I sat across from him in his office, a space lined with books that smelled faintly of dust and leather. Finch adjusted his glasses and pulled out a yellow legal pad. "Tell me exactly what you want." The words came easier than I expected. Scheduled visits, not surprise drop-ins. Babysitting only when arranged in advance and compensated fairly. No more spare keys passed around without my say. Respectful communication, no texts that treated me like a hired hand. And above all, acknowledgement that my place in this family wasn't optional decoration, but earned through years of love and sacrifice. Finch scribbled steadily, nodding at each point. "We'll call it grandma terms," he said with a dry smile. "Catchy enough that even Sable can't claim confusion." I laughed, though my chest was tight. Seeing my thoughts transformed into clauses and paragraphs made them real. For so long, I had relied on unspoken trust, only to watch it collapse. Now the trust would have a spine. When the draft was ready, Finch slid it across the table. "You don't need them to sign for this to matter," he said. "This is for you. But if they do sign, it's a commitment they can't easily twist." I held the papers in my hands, the black ink steady against the cream pages. It felt like armor, not against love, but against its misuse. That Sunday, I invited Evan and Sable to my house. I set the table simply, no flourishes, no gestures meant to impress. Jonah and Elise played upstairs while the three of us sat in the dining room, the stack of papers placed neatly in the center. "I've written down what I need from now on," I began. My voice was calm, even. "Not to push you away, but to make sure what I give is respected." Sable's eyes narrowed. Terms she repeated as though the word were sour. "Yes," I said. "Grandma terms." Evan reached for the papers first. His hands trembled slightly as he skimmed the lines. I watched his eyes flicker, first confusion, then recognition, and finally something heavier. Sable didn't bother to read. She crossed her arms and scoffed. "This is ridiculous. Families don't use contracts. Families shouldn't need them," I answered quietly. "But here we are." Evan cleared his throat. "Mom, this is reasonable." His words were soft, careful, but they landed like stones in the quiet room. Sable turned to him, her face flushing. "You can't be serious. You'd let her dictate how we live our lives." "No," he said slowly, "but I can let her dictate how she lives hers." The silence that followed was sharper than any argument. I didn't press. I didn't plead. I simply left the papers on the table, folded my hands, and waited. When they left an hour later, the document was still there, unsigned, but it didn't feel like failure. For the first time, my needs weren't invisible. They were printed, tangible, undeniable. After the door closed behind them, I carried the papers upstairs to my desk, sliding them into the drawer beside the brass key. Both were symbols of something I'd claimed at last, the right to set my own terms. And as I turned the lock, I knew the next test would come soon, whether love would bend enough to meet those terms, or whether it would break under their weight. The call came late at night. Evan's voice was tight, breathless, as though the words were fighting to get out. "Mom, it's Sable's dad. He had a stroke. We're at the hospital. Can you—" He stopped, then pushed it out. "Can you stay with the kids tonight?" I sat up in bed, the room still wrapped in shadows. My first instinct was the old one, throw on a coat, rush over without question. But then I remembered the papers in my desk drawer, the ink that had finally given shape to my boundaries. "Yes," I said. "After a pause, I'll come. But only tonight." When I arrived, the house was in disarray. Nothing like the spotless showroom I'd been shooed out of months earlier. Toys littered the floor, dishes piled in the sink, the air heavy with the frantic rush they'd left behind. Jonah's eyes were wide when he saw me, relief spilling across his face. Elise clung to my waist. "Grandma's here," I told them, smoothing their hair. "Everything's fine now." I made up the couch with blankets, then guided the children upstairs. We brushed teeth in a hurry, read a story about dragons, and I sat by their beds until their breathing slowed. My body remembered the rhythm of it, the steady watch through the night, the soft hum of reassurance. But this time, I didn't feel invisible. This time, I knew exactly why I was here, not to erase their responsibilities, not to save their pride, but because compassion can exist without being endless. In the morning, Evan returned. His eyes were red from exhaustion, his tie still hanging loose around his neck. "He's stable," he said, dropping into a chair. "They're running tests. Sable's staying with her mom for now." I poured him coffee and set the mug in front of him. For a long moment, he just stared into it, as if words were hiding at the bottom. Thank you, he said, finally. I know you said only one night, but one night I reminded him gently. That's what I agreed to. I'll be back at my house by noon. His shoulders slumped, torn between gratitude and desperation. It's just hard, Mom. Everything's falling apart. I sat across from him, my hands folded. Hard doesn't mean I go back to giving everything. You and Sable will find another way. You have to. He nodded slowly, eyes clouded with worry, but he didn't argue. That was new. I packed my things after breakfast, kissed Jonah and Elise goodbye, and drove home. The casserole dish I had used to carry dinner the night before sat on the passenger seat just as it had so many times before, but it felt different now. This wasn't a symbol of endless servitude. It was a single chosen act of care. When I unlocked my own front door, the quiet of my house wrapped around me. I slid the brass key in the drawer beside the grandma terms, the three objects forming a small trinity proof that love, boundaries, and dignity could coexist. As I sat at the desk, sunlight slanting across the journals I still kept from the attic, I felt the house breathe with me. For the first time, I understood that compassion didn't have to mean surrender. And I knew the time was coming when the truth of that lesson would be tested in front of more than just my family. The idea for the workshop came from Mina. One evening, as we walked the perimeter of my property, she said, "You've been carrying these stories in silence for too long. Others need to hear them, and you need to hear theirs." So I opened my doors. We cleared the parlor, set out folding chairs, brewed coffee, and laid out platters of cookies. Flyers had gone out through the community center and the church bulletin. By the afternoon, a small crowd of women, mostly gray-haired, some leaning on canes, others younger but already weary, filled the room. Mina stood at the front, poised as always, a quiet authority in her stance. Today, she said, we speak about respect boundaries and the invisible labor too often demanded of us. No shame, no judgment, only truth. The stories poured out. A woman described caring for 3 grandchildren while her daughter chased a career never thanked once. Another spoke of signing over her savings under pressure, left with nothing but regret. Heads nodded, tears glistened, hands squeezed in solidarity. When it was my turn, I rose slowly, the journals of Margaret the nurse resting on the table beside me like a talisman. I spent years giving freely, I said, voice steady, though my chest ached. Love without acknowledgement turns into labor without end. And when I finally said no, I was called selfish. Murmurs rippled low but fierce as women whispered agreement. Then the air shifted. The door at the back opened, and in walked Sable. Her heels clicked on the floorboards, her face set in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I just came to clarify a few things, she announced as though this were her stage. I've seen rumors spreading, and I won't let my family be slandered. Mina stepped forward, but I lifted a hand. Let her speak, I said quietly. Sable launched into a practiced speech about generosity, about how much she had included me, how ungrateful it was to demand payment from one's own family. A few women shifted uncomfortably, but most sat stone still, their silence sharp. Then Marjorie, bless her brave heart, stood from the back row. Funny, she said, holding up a printout. Because I saw this online. A post about hiring a professional nanny. No mention of Lorraine, as if she never existed. Gasps scattered through the room. Sable faltered, but before she could recover, Mina laid another page on the table, the screenshots Beatrix had given me. The group chat. The words better to cut her out of the inheritance conversation. The silence was suffocating. Every eye turned toward Sable. Her practiced composure cracked color rising in her cheeks. That's private, she hissed. Truth rarely stays private, Mina said evenly. I stood there, hands clasped in front of me, no anger on my face, only clarity. The room had seen. They had read. They understood. Sable's eyes darted to Evan, who had slipped in quietly at the back with the children. He didn't move to defend her. Jonah clutched his father's hand, Elise burying her face against his leg. For the first time, Sable looked small. And for the first time, I didn't feel erased. When the meeting ended, women crowded me with hugs, thanks, and tears. I slipped the screenshots back into my folder, sliding them beside the journals. Proof and history, side by side. And as the last chair folded away, I knew the choice ahead of me wasn't whether I could speak the truth anymore. It was whether I would forgive or enforce. Weeks passed before I heard from Evan again. Not a desperate call, not a text full of requests, just a message that said, "The kids and I would like to visit." No agenda, just us. When the day came, I heard the knock before I saw them. Jonah's small voice called out, "Grandma, we brought you something." I opened the door to find Evan holding a simple bouquet of daisies, Elise clutching a hand-drawn card with crooked hearts. There were no expectations in their eyes, only the quiet hope of being welcomed. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. The children darted toward the sunroom wall, squealing, when they saw their painted handprints still bright against the plaster. "You didn't clean it." Jonah laughed, and I smiled. "Of course not. That wall belongs to you." Evan stood in the doorway, shifting the flowers in his hands. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. His eyes were tired, but his voice carried a steadiness I hadn't heard in years. For my silence, for letting things get as far as they did. "You deserved better from me." I took the daisies from him, their stems cool against my palms. "Thank you," I said simply. It was all that needed to be spoken. We spent the afternoon together without pretense. No staged photos, no demands. Jonah helped me stir soup, while Elise arranged napkins like little triangles. Evan repaired a loose hinge on the back door, not because I asked, but because he noticed. The air felt different, lighter, as if the weight of expectation had finally lifted. When the sun dipped low, they gathered their coats. Elise hugged me tight and whispered, "I like it here, Grandma. It feels happy." Jonah nodded, crumbs of cookie still clinging to his shirt. After they left, I carried the daisies upstairs to my desk. I unlocked the drawer where the journals, the printed screenshots, and the envelope of tallied hours lay. Nestled among them was the brass key. I picked it up, feeling the cool weight in my hand, the symbol of everything I had reclaimed. I held it for a long moment, then placed it gently back inside the drawer, shutting it with care. The lock clicked final and sure. "Not for intrusion," I whispered to the quiet room. "Only for respect." Downstairs, I returned to the front door. The evening breeze drifted through the crack as I opened it wide. The house behind me was no longer silent, no longer shadowed. It was mine, every creak of the floorboards, every messy corner, every echo of laughter. And this time, the door stayed open, not because I was obligated, but because I chose it. On my terms. Always on my terms. Outline Lorraine arrives at her son's home with a warm casserole. Before she can ring the bell, a text buzzes, "Please don't come over. We just cleaned." She freezes, holding the dish. Looking through the window, she sees Sable laughing with clients in a spotless living room. Twist. She realizes she has been excluded, not for hygiene, but to maintain Sable's perfect image with buyers. Hook. When your welcome is erased for appearances, do you bow out or push the door? Flashback: Lorraine's youth husband left early. She raised Evan alone while working double shifts at the hospital. Her hands cracked from cleaning solutions, but she still taught Evan, discipline saved for his piano lessons, and celebrated milestones with joy. Hook, if sacrifice was the language of love, who teaches the translation back. At a family dinner, Lorraine notices new family portraits displayed perfectly styled, but she is cropped out in one photo. Subtle, but deliberate. Evan doesn't notice. Sable shrugs. Lorraine pockets the hurt silently. Hook. When your face is cut from the frame, can your place in the family still survive? Lorraine remembers the day Sable asked her to babysit just for a week. It turned into years of unpaid labor. She recalls once being given a spare key, but now Sable requests it back, claiming new locks for safety. Hook. What is a home key worth when it unlocks no respect? Lorraine calculates she's provided over $30,000 unpaid childcare hours. When Sable requests another favor, Lorraine quietly says she deserves to be paid like any professional. Hook. What happens when free love finally comes with a bill? Sable explodes, accusing Lorraine of being selfish. Evan tries to mediate, but his silence feels like betrayal. Lorraine leaves heartbroken but strangely steady. Hook, can a single no echo louder than years of yes? Sable posts online. Blessed to find a professional nanny so reliable, so perfect for our lifestyle. Thousands of likes. Lorraine feels erased in public. Twist of friend forwards. Lorraine screenshots of Sable discussing cutting Lorraine out of the inheritance conversation. Hook. If they erase you from their story, how do you write your own chapter? Wounded but resolute, Lorraine tours properties. Finch Marrow, her old lawyer friend, advises her on safe investments. She stumbles on a probate sale, a historic 2.5 meters house with medical history echoing her past as a hospital administrator. Hook. What if buying bricks and beams is the only way to rebuild dignity? Paperwork done. Lorraine owns it outright. She locks a single brass key in her desk, whispering, "Not for intrusion, only for respect." The house feels like a second chance. Hook, who earns the right to cross a new threshold, Lorraine explores the estate, finds old journals from a nurse who once fought for respect in a patriarchal hospital. The resonance gives Lorraine strength. Detective Mina's shoe neighbor becomes her walking partner. Hook. When history speaks your pain, do you listen or rewrite? Sable's real estate career begins faltering. Clients sense artificiality. Meanwhile, Lorraine refuses another last-minute babysitting plea. Evan feels torn. Hook. Can polish protect what is already crumbling? Lorraine hosts Jonah and Elise for a weekend at her mansion. They bake cookies, paint walls with washable colors, run wild. The house is messy but alive. Hook is happiness less real when it stains the carpet. One of Sable's major deals fails when she misses a client meeting. She had expected Lorraine to babysit. She lashes out, blaming Lorraine. Twist, a local blog, picks up the family conflict community, begins sympathizing with Lorraine's stance. Hook. What happens when public opinion flips the mirror back? With Finch, Lorraine drafts a document, her conditions for family involvement visits, scheduled no unpaid labor, mutual respect. She presents it calmly. Hook will love sign. What duty refused? Sable's father suffers a stroke. Childcare collapses. Lorraine helps once, but on her terms. She stays one night, then leaves, proving she can care without being used. Hook is compassion stronger when it comes with boundaries. Lorraine hosts an elder rights workshop at her estate. Women share stories. Detective Shu moderates. Unexpectedly, Sable arrives defensive. Evidence surfaces, cropped photos. Hurtful texts. The community witnesses. Hook. When the crowd finally sees the truth, do you forgive or enforce? Weeks later, Evan and the kids bring flowers. This time, no demands, just presents. Lorraine unlocks her desk, places the brass key inside. She opens her front door on her terms. Hook. When respect finally knocks, will you open or guard the key forever?